Welcome everybody to GoLocal Live. I'm Josh Fenton, CEO and co-founder. A lot of news this weekend, some of it good, some of it bad, but it was great weather all weekend. If you haven't seen it this morning, AstraZeneca is poised to file with the FDA for an emergency use authorization. This will make 4 vaccines, if approved by the FDA and then by the CDC, to be able to be jabbed in Americans' arms, hopefully putting a major dent in the coronavirus. So stay tuned for more up on that. Also, Rhode Island moved into second place for the most cases per 100,000 population, second only behind New Jersey. So deep concerns by public health experts here in Rhode Island. I also want to give an update. Dr. Michael Fine will join us, as he usually does, this afternoon at 1:30 to talk about those 2 issues, as well as concerns about the New York variant. I want to now go to James Liebman. He's a professor at Columbia Law School, and he's been looking at the issue of charter schools and what the implications are of a political battle that's going on in Rhode Island. Legislators, specifically over on the Senate side, are pushing for legislation to put a halt to the expansion of over 5,800 charter school seats that have been approved by the Department of Education and are poised next week to open their lotteries for their students. They've already found buildings, hired staff, etc. Professor Liebman, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
So let's kick this off. You've spent a lot of time, and listen, you've worked for Bloomberg at the Department of Education in the city of New York. You've battled cases to the US Supreme Court. You're at one of the preeminent law schools in the country. And specifically, you've been looking at how dollars impact education as they relate to charter schools, where the money goes, who are the high performers. Give an overview of what your research has shown.
Yeah, so what I'm really trying to do is to try to trace the return on investment in children and students that states make through their public education systems, which of course have both traditional public schools or district schools and charter schools. And so what I did was to pick out the top states in the country in terms of the academic performance, the comparative academic performance of charter school students, and then go look at, in a very detailed way, the way their statutes work to both encourage academic improvement for students, but also to be cognizant of the potential physical impact on school districts and the students who remain being educated in the public schools of the district. And so Rhode Island was one of those states that I researched because its charter schools are high performing relative to other students and relative to other states. And I did a deep dive into the statute there to determine how that statute works, both to get those good academic outcomes, but also what the impact on school districts is of the students moving into charter schools, and found that actually Rhode Island is one of the top states in the country legislatively in terms of the steps that it has taken to moderate and indeed really avoid physical impact on school districts from students moving into charter schools.
Listen, it's no secret that Providence schools, Pawtucket schools, Central Falls, but Providence made national headlines nearly 2 years ago when Johns Hopkins rated it amongst the worst, if not the worst, school system in the country. That's putting it behind places like Aroostook County, Maine, wildly driven by poverty, or Mississippi, or places that it just seem unfathomable that a capital city with an Ivy League school could have worse schools than those communities. The charters have been the exception, and in the case of the mayoral academies / Achievement First, if you take those mayoral academies, set them aside and make them a standalone school district, they're the best performing school district in the state of Rhode Island, ahead of affluent communities like Barrington and East Greenwich. Talk about, if you've seen it in your research, why those charters are outperforming not only urban schools, but suburban affluent schools.
Yes, well, Rhode Island is not the only place that happens, although it is in a minority of states where that happens, but that actually is true here in New York State as well, one of the charter management organizations here, Success Academies, has also outperformed not only all of the city schools here in New York City, but also suburban schools, including some of the richest suburbs in in the country. The reason is that if the state's law is designed right, and this is something that my research has really demonstrated, that state laws have tremendous impact on the quality of charter schools in states. And so in many states, charter schools do not outperform traditional district schools because their statutes don't insist upon measures to make sure that the charters that get authorized, the schools that get authorized, are going to outperform, and then they don't keep up with whether they do outperform. But in Rhode Island, that has not been the case. It's a very careful process to authorize charter schools and then to review those charter schools. And they've attracted some of the top organizations and schools to Rhode Island and maintained this very high performance level. So I credit the Rhode Island statute really with a lot of the structures that have enabled charter schools in the state to perform at such a high level.
Professor, one of the things that's going on up at the State House, prompted by the teachers union, is an effort to roll back the approval of 5,800 new charter seats. That effort is under the guise of, let's just wait. Let's just see how these things progress. We don't want to take the money out of these school systems and shift it over to charters. Talk about that argument and what the flaws of that argument are.
Well, first of all, I think it's really important to understand that as a result of a variety of changes to the charter law in Rhode Island over the years, since it was first adopted in the 1990s, Rhode Island has taken more steps than almost any other state, maybe than any other state, to moderate the fiscal impact of charter students. So right now, every charter student who leaves a district and goes to a charter school actually leaves behind 12% or more of the funds that that district would have devoted to that student had that student remained there. So what's happening is in Rhode Island, every new charter school, every new charter expansion, every new charter student actually raises the fiscal situation for the kids who remain in the district. To put it another way, the amount of spending per student increases in Rhode Island every time a charter student leaves because they leave behind some of the funding. And the legislature has been very careful to control for all kinds of different expenses that districts have that outlast a student leaving. So yes, there are some expenses that aren't covered when a student leaves, but the Rhode Island does not transfer all of the money with that student. They keep money behind for the school district. So what you have in Rhode Island is kind of a win-win situation. The students that go to the charter schools are performing at a higher level. This cuts across all categories: special education, English language learners, low-income students. They're performing higher than they would have if they'd stayed in the district. But they're not taking as much money because the districts are underfunded compared to district schools. So they're leaving behind extra resources that the school districts can use to improve. And there is a history across the country, and we're hoping to see it obviously now in Providence and elsewhere in Rhode Island, including with the state takeover of Providence, that with that extra funding, there will be the capacity to improve the district schools as well. And so it can turn out to be kind of a win-win situation for the state and its kids.
Yeah, Professor, I appreciate that. I think that's an important point. Let's go to performance. Here's Providence, Pawtucket, Central Falls, Woonsocket. You go into the RICAS scores and you look at those numbers and you see that 6% in English and math are meeting expectations, 1% or less, an immeasurable, a number that can't even be measured, are exceeding expectations. At what point, this has gone on for decades here in Providence, at what point is there a real, you've been to the Supreme Court, is there a civil rights issue? Is there an equity issue? Is this just generation after generation condemned to terrible schools?
Well, I definitely think that we need to think in terms of a constitutional right to education. And there is in some states. Rhode Island has not been as forceful in its Supreme Court at interpreting the right to education in its constitution as in some other states. I want to be clear here. I am a very big proponent of public education. There's something that public education serves that you can't get from other kinds of education, from private and parochial education, vouchers, and those sorts of things. What I think is really important about charter schools, especially given the way that Rhode Island's statute works, is to insist that those schools serve the public interest at the same time as they create options and flexibility. And what you are seeing in Rhode Island is that those options and flexibility have improved the opportunities for students in the state. And so, what I would encourage Rhode Island to do and see it on a path to doing, it needs to do more of, is to figure out ways to create additional ways of providing flexibility to meet the needs of families and their kids in the public schools while maintaining a public school system with all of the values that public education has. And so I think Rhode Island has a good statute for charter schools, and that the expansion that it's experienced, which is not much greater than many other states with strong charter schools. It's not like it's taking huge chunks out of the public school system, and it's keeping the funding so that the funding is supporting the district schools. And I guess I would say I think Rhode Island has something good going in that way, and that it ought to keep that going and improve that. And some of the steps that I see occurring in Providence through the state takeover seem to me to be promising in that regard. And I would, encourage the state to give those changes a chance here and to let them go forward.
Professor, you get the last word. What do people need to know? This bill's coming up in House Finance tomorrow night. I believe you're going to be testifying via the power of the internet and a Zoom. Give a little insight. What do people in Rhode Island need to know from your perspective?
Well, I think what they need to know is that their school systems and their public schools, whether you think about it on an aggregate budget basis or a pure pupil basis, have not actually lost money to charter schools. For one thing, the charter schools are leaving some money behind for the public schools. But the other thing that I think is really important is that as charter schools enrollment has grown, the school districts from which they are taking students, especially the urban districts, but even the suburban ones, are not actually losing students. They're staying the same. So those charter schools, among other things they're doing, they're attracting kids back into the public system who haven't been into the public system, and in a sense paying for themselves by attracting more state money to those localities for public education. So as I said before, I think the charter schools in Rhode Island are kind of a win-win situation for kids, for districts, and for the state, and that it's a good thing Rhode Island has going compared to other states, some of the top in the country in that regard, and I'd encourage them to stick with it.
Professor James Liebman, Columbia Law School, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. We look forward to hearing your testimony tomorrow afternoon before House Finance. This is a hot issue. GoLocal has been covering it all year long. Please stay tuned for more coverage of it. It's an education battle. It's an opportunity for kids in Rhode Island to get a better education. We'll be on it. For everybody else, stay tuned. 1:30, Dr. Michael Fine will be joining us, cover the issues related to AstraZeneca. Rhode Island's increased, now number 2 in the country of cases per 100,000, according to COVID Act Now. And third of all, deep concerns about the New York variant and whether or not existing vaccines, as they are constituted now, will be effective against that new strain that is developing. Everybody stay safe. Please wear your mask, and we'll see you later at 1:30. Thank you.